His people were a peaceful species. They didn't start wars unless forced, nor did they seek out conflict unless it came to them. They had long moved past their brutal nature, beyond the bloodlust and conflict of centuries. Once confined beneath their two suns, they had evolved significantly before joining the greater galaxy. Although their bodies still bore the signs of warriors, sharp talons and massive builds that made other species hesitate, they mostly avoided violence. He was a trader, journeying through the galaxy, gathering goods for his homeworld and selling the fine inventions his people dreamed up. He might not have been as brilliant as his people's scientists or as clever as their diplomats, but he didn't mind. He knew numbers and schedules and enjoyed bartering and trade. It was a good, simple life. Yet, like any of his people, should he ever cross paths with slavers, he would set aside his simple life to deal with them. His people were peaceful, true, but they never forgot their roots. They never turned their backs on the painful history that first brought their ancestors into the greater galaxy and would never allow a monster to live. That was how he found himself on the slaver ship one day, listening as their alarms blared warnings, though no pirates were left alive to heed them. He stared down at the small alien child in the holding cell. He had never seen an alien quite like her, pink-orange flesh with a hint of brown and eyes with a circle of color as vivid as the sky on his homeworld. She seemed so soft, so delicate as she trembled where she stood, pressing her hands over her ears, her eyes shining with tears. She was most certainly a child, even if he wasn't sure from what species. A frightened child. He shouldn't waste time here. The slavers were dead, and he had done his sacred duty. One of the others could take care of this child, one of those they had freed. The child was not his problem, yet he couldn't help noticing how different she looked from all the other prisoners. She wasn't part of any of their species. In fact, none of the other now freed slaves seemed to know her. She was alone here, alone and scared. So, though he knew he had schedules to keep and trade to conduct, and no time to waste, he found himself crouching down to her level, flattening his feather crest to appear less threatening, and holding out a hand when he noticed her frightened eyes catch on his pendant, a family heirloom he wore with constant pride. He found himself handing it to her. Her eyes widened as she turned it about, mesmerized by the eternal fire gem within. She was a curious child, he soon learned. Her fear quickly melted away, replaced by a powerful sort of confidence. She didn't flinch away from his visage, as other species so often did, and didn't seem fazed by any of his crew once she learned they weren't like the slavers. She didn't hide away in the guest quarters like the others they had freed, thankful for rescue yet still afraid. If anything, she grew comfortable around his crew, constantly poking at their feathers and watching everything they did with wide eyes. He quickly became used to her, the way she followed him like a small silent shadow, always clutching his pendant between her little hands, the way she perked up when watching the crew fly the ship, how she darted about the cockpit and rose up on her toes to peer over their workstations, looking closely at what each person did, the way she'd rock back and forth on her feet when thinking hard and stick her tongue out the gap in her front teeth, a thing that should look absurd yet was somehow oddly endearing. She didn't talk ever, but as time went on, he was sure she could understand them. Despite her youth, there was an intelligence in her eyes, a meaning to the excited catch of her breath. the way her fingers would tap, 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 so quickly against the pendant when she seemed to finally realize how something around the ship worked. When the crew reached the station and dropped the other rescued people off, he was almost relieved to learn that nobody knew what she was. Relieved, though also sad, for though he was glad to keep her on board, glad to not have to say goodbye, he also saw the grief that shadowed her face from time to time, noticed the way tears rolled down her cheeks on days she fell asleep curled up in his captain's chair, as if in her dreams she couldn't avoid the memories of whatever home she missed. She was a child. She needed her people. So his crew began to inquire after her when they stopped at different stations. They showed her hollow image around and sought out anyone that might know where she belonged. They sent a formal request to the homeworld, asking for help in searching for this child's people. On the ship, he did his best to keep her content. He traded for clothing she seemed to like, outfits with loose sleeves and soft materials that didn't make her squirm and cry. He learned what caught her interest, like how she'd grow so still and listen with rapt attention when he explained how the ship's controls worked, or how her eyes would widen with excitement when he sometimes let her press on the control screen to select their route, once she understood enough not to warp them into a star. He bought her toys when trading with new space stations, sought out children's media on the holopad, and quietly, carefully ensured all the dangerous items on the ship were safely secured out of reach. He wasn't a parent. He didn't always know what he was doing. Was it safe to let her bite on the pendant, as she sometimes did when thinking hard? Should he worry that she didn't like to look any of his crew in the eye? Was he feeding her the right foods for her species, giving her the right amount of attention? Was she supposed to be so small? And why, oh why, did she always seem to get into trouble when he had only looked away for a moment? He did not know how to raise a child, especially an alien one with pink skin and wide eyes, and not a single feather to be seen. Yet, he did his best. It was a bittersweet day when he finally found a space station where she was recognized, a human. The aliens insisted they would know. They were explorers and historians. The child he cared for was a human, part of a newer species. The human story was a tragic one, though not unheard of. The Christian Empire found them before any other and did its best to enslave them before they could reach a level of advancement that would allow the Galactic Senate to recognize them. Yet humans overcame, reverse-engineered, captured Christian ships, fought back with surprising resilience, and even showed up at a grand Senate meeting to demand they be recognized. It had caused quite a stir recently. Otherwise, though, they were unremarkable. Their tech was still barely anything despite their fast progress, and their people were not particularly strong or long-lived. Though they were a clever species, they were also far too busy trying to find and reclaim all their stolen people, and thus had little time to dip a toe into the greater galaxy's politics. They were, quite frankly, forgettable. Forgettable or not, he was relieved. Now he knew what the child was. He knew how to find her people. He would miss her, to be sure, but she belonged among her own kind. He tried not to be sad the day his ship made a detour for the human planet, a ramshackle place they called Earth. He tried not to let his crest fall down, giving away his emotions when the little human girl ran towards her mother, flapping her hands and crying, rocking back and forth as her mother hugged her, and rocked as well. The humans were thankful. They offered for his crew to stay and celebrate with them, yet the translator technology was still learning human languages, so their voices were jarring to listen to. The human air weighed heavy on his feathers, and a lump in his throat threatened to color his every word with bittersweet grief. So he politely declined, returning to his ship and his life as a simple trader. He thought of the child from time to time over the years when humans cropped up in the news, such a determined species, with how fast they spread through the stars. He wondered how she was doing. When his sister berated him for losing their family's heirloom pendant, he wondered if she still fidgeted with it often. When his government announced they would dedicate resources to helping humans claim back their own from slavers, for his people would never forget the pain of their own roots, he wondered if she still had nightmares. Sometimes, when he plotted new routes on his holoscreen, he wondered if there were ships on Earth the child could learn to use, places where she could satisfy that endless curiosity. At times, he thought about going back to visit, but decided it was better not to. The human child was with her people now, and his presence might be nothing more than a reminder of the trauma she had gone through. Besides, the humans knew who he was. The child could contact him if she truly desired, but he shouldn't force it on her. While at times he had almost felt like a parent to her, she wasn't his child, not truly. He wasn't good with emotion, wasn't good at handling the way things could feel and hurt. So he shoved that all away and carried on with his work. Life went on. Days passed, then years. He settled back into his routines, took comfort in the familiarity of his life, and eventually once again grew used to wandering his ship without a small, curious shadow to follow him. He certainly never imagined that saving her might cause ripples. He was much older the next time he found his routine disrupted, his feathers growing ragged and his bones more often tired. It rode in on news from the homeworld, grim news. An experiment gone wrong, their primary sun likely to implode, their sacred home soon to be destroyed. He knew his duty, and so, though he felt the specter of death hovering over him as he gave the order to return, his ship jumped back to the home system, and they began to help with the evacuations. It wasn't enough, of course. Even with every single one of their people's ships returning to help, it still wasn't enough. They would never get everyone off the homeworld in time. They might not even save a fraction of their people. His people put out a call to the galaxy as a whole, begging for anyone available to come help. They should have known better, for who would be foolish enough to enter a solar system with a star that might implode at any moment, especially when the source of their despair was of their own making. It didn't matter how much their people had helped others or how important their role in the Galactic Senate had been before this. No sane species was going to help. No others would risk their ships in such a way. They were alone, or perhaps not. It was on his fourth jump in and out of the system, as he was loading more people into the ship, while guards urged the masses not to panic or overwhelm the rescue ships, that they arrived. A blip on the radars, then another and another. Primitive, hastily built starships dropped into their system. So many, he could hardly believe it. Shortly after, a communication was sent out to all ships around the homeworld. It was the humans. The humans were here to help. The human ships joined their efforts immediately, and soon he found himself flying back and forth from the distant colonies to the homeworld, not just beside his own people, but beside human ships as well. They worked tirelessly through waking cycles and sleeping cycles, through more jumps than a body should sustain. They hauled countless evacuees to safety until finally the scientists said it was too dangerous, too risky to carry on. Even then, many of the humans went back into one final load, one last group of people, each filling their small starships to the brim before jumping back out of the system. Then it was over. He listened to the reports with the others, watched the sensors as their primary sun gave in, its gravity taking over, the star's mass falling inward until suddenly, light, an explosion so powerful, his ship's sensors read it even many systems away. The blast wave destroyed everything, ravaged the system's planets, and triggered the collapse of their secondary star. He watched the reports with numb grief, a sort of grief so strong he couldn't box it up, and shove it away as he longed to. Later that day, when the officials took a tally of all who had been rescued and escaped, his grief only grew. So many of his people perished, so many people still left on the homeworld or on the colonies within the system. Yet, so too was there an odd sort of relief. Not all was lost, for many of his people still lived, many more than he had ever dreamed when he made the choice to return and help, more than anyone had dared to hope for. The humans had saved them. There had been no reason to risk themselves in such a way, no reason to help when it had no benefit for them. Yet humans had shown up in massive quantities, sending what surely had to be the majority of their spacefaring fleet to aid in the rescue efforts. If they had lost their ships, if they lost that small bit of defense their planet had, the Christen would surely take advantage and sweep back in to overrun them. Politics be damned. The humans risked everything to help his people. He expected it when he heard that his leaders would meet officially with the humans to share their thanks and form a lasting alliance. What he did not expect was for his own ship to receive a simple call from one of the smaller human ships requesting permission for its captain to come on board. He was puzzled as to what any human would want with a simple trade ship like his. Though he wondered, and as he rallied his crew to put on their best outfits and translators to wait at the airlock door, he let himself hope. He recognized the human when she entered, walking a few steps behind her captain. She was a young woman now, with a confident stance that spoke of experience and rigorous training. She wore a formal enough uniform that he was sure she was important within her ship, even if she only had a few shiny medals compared to her captain. Though he didn't know enough about the humans to know just what her rank might be, it was clear she had done well for herself and had proven herself among the humans over the years. It was in the way the others around looked to her, gazes full of respect, or how she stood in a position of importance beside the human captain. And though custom dictated that the captain should say the first greeting, the older human stepped back and nodded to her. The other humans waited patiently as she typed into the small communications device she held. He was so used to her silence, so used to the memory of her as the quiet, observant shadow, that he was startled when she pressed the final button on the device and it spoke for her. "Hello, Captain. I believe I am overdue in returning this to you," she said, reaching into her pocket and pulling out a pendant with a red fire gem set in the center. He couldn't help smiling, no matter the grief that still hung heavy in his heart. He wondered, Had she helped convince Earth's leaders to come help his people? Or did Earth simply help because that was the nature of humanity, just as his own people could not ignore those truly in need? More than that, though, he wondered about her. What was her role on the human ship? Had she learned their technology inside and out, as she tried to do on his own ship when she was his shadow all those years ago? Was she eating well? Was she happy? He would need to ask her when they had time to talk more, after the formal greetings and introductions were done, and perhaps set up a way to reach her once they eventually parted again, as he should have done so long ago. He was so proud of her, so thankful she hadn't ever forgotten, even if she was just as bad as he was at communicating and keeping in touch. His child had found her way back to him,